Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the webinar Mini Grid Planning, Integrated Energy Planning for Rural Electrification. My name is Ranisha Basnit, and today I'll be moderating this webinar along with my colleague Dipti Vaghela from HPNet. As you know, this webinar is a part of a series of webinars on on different mini grid topics. So I do encourage you to check out all the previous webinars where we talked about different issues such as reliability, financing, and sustainability of mini grids. And we will share the link with a link to this webinar in the follow-up email that will be sent out to you. And do stay tuned for our upcoming webinars in 2020. So a quick shout out to all our partners. So this webinar is a joint collaboration between Energypedia, HPNet, and Wisions. Wisions is an initiative run by Wuppertal Institute that aims to promote the transition to sustainable energy systems in the global south. Energypedia is a non-profit organization that runs and maintains the the wiki-based platform www.energypedia.info. And finally, Hydro Empowerment Network is a network of practitioners working in microhydrotropics in the global south, and it focuses mainly on knowledge exchange, strategy advocacy, and thematic focus area. After a quick shout out to our partners, I just wanted to give a small tip to our audience. So on the right side of your screen, you should see a control panel. There you should have an option called as questions. So what we will do is during the webinar, we will take in all of your questions and we will try to address to each of the speakers towards the end, towards the Q&A session. So please feel free to type in your questions, your suggestions, or your chats during the during the webinar, and we'll collect all of them and pass it to the respective speakers towards the end. And please do also tell us to whom it is addressed to. So speaker 1, speaker 2, and so on. So it will help us to give the question to the respective speaker. So moving forward. And now it's the time for short polls. So before we kickstart with the actual content of the webinar, we want to know a bit more about you. So I'm going to launch a poll on your screen. So 1 second, please. So you should see a question popping in your screen. And the question is, how familiar are you with the integrated energy planning for rural electrification, the topic for today's webinar? And if you could tell us if you just know about the topic, I mean, you're just starting to get to know about it and so on. So we have questions, we have polls coming in. So I'm gonna leave it for a few more seconds and wait for a few more seconds. And now I'm gonna close the poll and then display the results. So we have a lot of people in the audience who are somewhat familiar or very familiar, and some who have advanced knowledge, and also people who are just starting out with the topic. So we hope this webinar will be interesting to all of you, and all of you have something to take away from the webinar. So I'm gonna now start with the second poll to know a bit more about you, and that's why I'm gonna again launch one question on your screen. So if you could also tell us what best describes your current work. So that means, are you associated with the government? Are you working in the mini grid development? Are you renewable energy? Are you involved in the renewable energy finance? So just tell us where you are working. So this is just to understand you, the audience, and to make sure that our future webinars will also be tailored to different kind of audience. So since the answers are coming in, I'm going to leave it for a few more seconds. And now I'll close it and display the poll results. So we have a lot of people who are working in mini grid development, followed by academic research, and also others occupy a huge portion of it. Thank you so much once more time for taking part in our webinar, in our poll. And now I'm going to hide the results and then go back to sharing the screen for the presentation. So without further ado, now I would like to start with the presentation for today by welcoming our first speaker, Dr. Katharina Keder. Dr. Katharina is working with the Rainer Lehmann Institute since 2012 and is part of the research unit off-grid system. And she is an expert in geographical information system, GIS, and rural electrification planning. Today, Katharina is going to talk about her experience with GIS, especially in the Tanzanian context. Katharina, the floor is yours. I'm going to quickly pass you a request to share your screen. So I've sent you a, yes, we can see your screen now.
Do you see the full screen?
No, I only see partial screen with, yes.
Sorry, let me just quickly change that. Now you see the full screen, right?
Yes, I see the full screen now.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. I'm very pleased to be a speaker at today's webinar and to present a bit on our work on integrated energy planning from our perspective here at Rainer Lehmann Institute. So to start with a very brief overview, Rainer Lehmann Institute is a non-profit research institute, and we're actually founded by a foundation in 2010. And we grew quite a bit over the last years. And right now we are about 70 researchers, but also lots of academic people. So we have PhD students, masters and bachelor students supporting our research here at the Institute. The work we do takes place in 3 different fields of research. So we have one unit which is called Transformation of Energy Systems. There we develop large-scale energy system models to understand how a transformation towards renewable energy can take place, considering different technologies and options. Then in the second team, the mobility with renewable energy section, we try to understand the role of clean mobility and transport options in the overall energy systems. And then there's the team I'm working in, which is the off-grid systems team, where we specifically look at areas where clean energy supply is still an issue. And we develop strategies for rural electrification, try to understand hybrid mini-grids, and use lots of GIS analysis, where I will focus on for today's presentation, and also understand market potentials for different options. So a bit about the off-grid system. Our overarching mission is to support the Sustainable Development Goal number 7 to supply clean electricity in all parts of the world where it's not yet available. And there's a threefold motivation for that. So we say that renewable energies provide economic, ecologic, and social solutions to improve the local situations. And we mostly do that in the countries which you can see here on the right, in sub-Saharan Africa, but also in selected countries in Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia. Here's a stronger focus on island nations, where access to electricity is still an issue. We do that in 3 different areas. So the first area is a decentral supply system analysis. There we focus a lot on energy system modeling. But then we also carry out overarching rural electrification planning, where GIS and demand modeling plays a major role. But then more and more, we also feel that a very important topic is the climate resilience and transformation of energy systems in today's discussions of global climate change and climate impacts of energy solutions. And these three topics we approach and always try to deepen by international collaboration, knowledge transfer, networking activities, but also tool development. To be a bit more specific about the different areas, for the understanding of the decentral supply systems, we carry out the simulation of energy systems so that we do understand, for example, which would be the best combination of different technologies in hybrid systems, what kind of different sizes would we require to supply given demand, and also what kind of operational strategies would we require in order to minimize the levelized cost of energy. To understand what would a system cost and how would the technical configuration look like. Then for the rural electrification planning, we carry out renewable energy resource assessments. We try to understand current power supply infrastructures. Sometimes there's nothing much, but in very many cases there's already always something, like for example diesel generators or other fossil fuel based supply systems. But then we also do other things like the application of database systems in order to carry out large-scale analysis. And then we also look at the demand modeling part to better understand what would be the correct size of a system, what would be the demand for electricity in a given place, but also the ability to pay for that services. And therefore, we do develop digital surveys to get a better understanding of local situations in order to develop and suggest systems which actually meet the local demand and the local situation. And then, as I said, the third part, we look at climate change resilience, and it can be a twofold thing. So one thing is that we do try to look at the climate resilience of energy systems itself, but then we also try to understand how clean energy systems can improve the resilience of the living situation of people in a given location. And then we also see what kind of political and social impacts does that relate to and what that require in order to improve situations. Now I'm going to talk a little bit more about the second part and try to give you an understanding on what we do for the GIS part in our research. So we do have some kind of leading questions which are always coming back to us, which we try to shed some light on with the methodologies we develop. So the very first question seems like a very basic one, but in some areas it's not that clear, or the respective people don't have that knowledge in a very accurate level of detail. So the first question is that we actually need to understand where the people live without the access to electricity. So where the villages actually are, and what the status of energy supply is of those people. With that knowledge, we can then think about the next question, which is what would be the potential electricity demand and ability to pay for those people. And knowing that, we can look at different options to supply electricity to those people. Another more detailed question could then be, how can that situation which we would foresee in that question be fulfilled by a phase-wise electrification plan, for example, because what we see is that we might have a certain level of electrification in a given place, but it will always be like a phase-wise improvement of the situation. So it won't be that we have 20% access to electricity and then we will have 100%, but we see that it's kind of a stepwise improvement. And then with that, we kind of create that understanding of the overall role of decentralized energy systems to see what role they play in the discussion with considering grid extension and mini grids, because often we still hear that one limiting factor for the mini grids is that there is a fear that the grid might come, but I think this is getting of less and less importance these days, because there are lots of advantages of the decentralized systems. So a bit more specific, often we do get questions how we would classify a very good project location for a decentralized system. And then we can ask several questions. So what would be, for example, the status quo in that situation? Is there already something like a diesel generator, or is there not much at all? And it would be more a greenfield approach to suggest a very new solution. Based on that difference, we might already know a bit more. If there's already a diesel generator, there's much more information on how much people consume already and how much they pay for electricity compared to a location where there's nothing much at all. And then there are very many different customer types. So they are just households, but there could also be industrial sites. Then based on that, there are also different supply structures like IPPs or utility focused solutions. And then, of course, we do have very different sizes of solutions, very small scale solutions, but also larger scale solutions, which can still run in island mode in an off-grid system, which then lead to very different financing requirements. And also, maybe depending on the technologies, we need to understand the project lifetime. That's focusing on a project, but we could also try to understand an overall market, which we then would kind of accumulate the previous information. So we would like to understand what would be the overall size of such an off-grid market in a specific region, and what kind of exclusion criteria do we have maybe in a given area, and also what kind of existing sales networks could be there, what's the accessibility of a certain location, and also is there some kind of some potential for replicability of the solution, because there are very many similar sites in a region, which could potentially, which mini-grid developer ask us frequently. And with our GIS methods, we try to combine geospatial information to shed some light on some of those aspects. So when we look at the overarching project value chain of a mini-grid, for example, which you could see here, we do see our work as a very first step to kind of get an overarching understanding of a situation in a given region before all the other steps will follow with much more detailed assessments. So for us, it's kind of, we see ourselves as kind of being active in the pre-feasibility section to get a better understanding of what could be a potential market, what could be a potential solution scenario for a given area. And how we do that, it all is based on data. So depending on the data, we can get here some example data sets. We can create different levels of, we use different tools and models in order to get certain information. I just go a bit quickly here. So the first thing is that we try to understand where we have the people. Then, as I said, what's the electricity demand of those people? What would be the electrification options? And then we can use that information in order to derive the least cost planning. And from each of those steps, we do get the results on a high spatial resolution. So we can look at individual sites, which then help us to understand how a specific region looks like. And we can carry out all those steps, but sometimes we start off with a reduced approach and only look at some of the steps. For example, the first step, try to understand where are the people and what is their status of electrification in order to see what would be a potential off-grid market and how could it be prioritized. This is something which I would like to show you for the case of Tanzania in the next few minutes, how that then could look like. There, within a World Bank IFC project, we developed some kind of a prioritization of the off-grid market in Tanzania, which we did in those 3 steps. So first is always data collection, then there's some data processing and analysis, and then we do have some results which we could either prioritize or also visualize. And we feel that the visualization of spatial data in form of maps is a very, very helpful tool for all stakeholders to be part of the discussion when we talk about where do we actually have off-grid areas and how can they be characterized. So we use the geospatial information which we can get, and there's quite some data for most of the countries in order to combine as much attributes to those population cluster as possible. For example, we could calculate the distance to transmission and distribution grids. We could add information on local infrastructures, if there are social infrastructures like health stations or schools. And then based on that, we can carry out a prioritization of those locations in order for their attractiveness for off-grid systems. So the common examples which we can get is information such as what is the population of a given site, what is the distance to the grid, what about the proximity to the social infrastructure such as health centers or schools, but also depending on the data availability, it could be other things such as is there mobile phone coverage, so mobile payments are easily possible, or is that something which should be integrated into the overarching system. And then when we have that information, we can add other levels of depth. For example, we could add the modeling of the electricity demand. So we had some projects where we carried out surveys and collected secondary data sets in order to understand better what the ability to pay could be in a certain location. And that could be then, of course, also added to the different areas we look at. And how would that actually look like in an interactive way? For the case of Tanzania, we developed an online tool, which I very quickly show to you. Just let me know if you're not seeing it. So here you do see that online tool for the case of Tanzania, and now you can discover it interactively. For example, I can show you the case of zooming into the Kigoma region. In orange, you see the existing grid. And when I zoom in a little bit, you see the population clusters where we do have lots of attributes combined with it. So when we, for example, click on one, we do see, for example, the administrative information. We see if there's already grid in that place. We see the distance to the grid. We see how many people we would estimate to live there. Here we combined the different social infrastructures in a binary variable if it's available or not. And then we can even zoom in deeper to actually see how that village looked like. So here you can actually see there was a mapping done of the building footprints. So you actually see where you have the houses and the road network. And you can also change the appearance and you change the base layer and to actually look at the satellite imagery here. So you can actually get a first idea on how that site looks like. And then that web tool also has a bit more functionalities. So you can also use interactive filters if, for example, a mini-grid developer has certain internal criteria that they say, well, our mini-grid has to be at least 5 kilometers off the grid, and there has to be at least a population of 1,000 people. Then we see that there are already quite fewer sites available. So actually here they all fall out because they are probably too small and too close to the grid. So if I would change that again, you would see that they reappear here and that we have a cluster here fulfilling that criteria. And please feel free to take time to look at that tool for yourself. There's information on the methodology and on the data which was used for that overall Tanzania case. Just very quickly, right now I would like to show you a few limitations of what we find when we work with satellite imagery, just because I think it's very important to talk about limitations, because it's only I think it's important to also talk about the downsides of certain methodologies and to in order to understand their full scope. So we do feel that in some parts there's a very quick development ongoing in the countries we look at. And for the case of Tanzania, we looked at different satellite data sources, and this is actually the very same site. But you see that there's a fast development ongoing, and suddenly population is growing. We see more buildings. The same case here. In red, you see a few circles now. When you compare here the left side to here, we actually see that lots of new buildings are popping up, which of course then impacts the overall analysis, the population assessment, and the ability to pay, willingness to pay. And then also we do see that there are very different settlement structures which also impact on mini-grid development. So here, for example, you see 3 different types of settlements, very interesting structures. Very often we see this case here in the middle where we have settlements alongside roads, which make it a bit more challenging to think about where to put the center of a mini-grid compared to a more circular shape. Or we see very interesting structures as here on the left where we see these circular arrangements of population within this agricultural setting. And then also there are very different types. That's again both in Tanzania, but that case here on the left, we see the housing material really shows that there's probably much higher ability to pay compared here to the right side, where we see a much more agricultural setting, very small huts. So now when we just talk about the number of population, it's a very limiting factor, because when we see these 2 different sites and they might both have like 2,000 inhabitants, we understand that the ability to pay might be very different. Yes, I think with that I come to the end of my presentation, and I'm happy to receive your questions later.
Thank you, Katerina. That was really an interesting presentation, and we have been receiving a lot of questions about it, and we will pass them to you towards the Q&A session.
Okay.
First, let me switch back to my screen. 1 second, please. So now I've switched back to my screen, and I'll quickly mute you too.
Okay.
So after Katerina's presentation about the GIS and how GIS can be used in energy planning, we want to move to Nigeria. And then for that, I want to invite our second speaker for today, Dr. Victor Osu. Dr. Victor is presently the Senior Advisor to the Executive Director, Rural Electrification Funds in the Rural Electrification Agency, and he's currently coordinating the implementation of over 10 mini-grids and 18,000 solar home systems. And today, Victor is going to talk about his experiences and his lessons learned from Nigeria. So Victor, the floor is yours. Before I pass this screen to you, I just also wanted to make a quick announcement. We have been getting a lot of Q&As, questions about the webinar videos and the presentation. We will make the video as well as the webinar presentation online after the webinar. So after the webinar, you will get a link in the follow-up email where you'll have the option to download the presentation and also watch the recording afterwards. And as I mentioned before, we are collecting questions during the presentations. So please feel free to send us the questions during the presentation, and you can send in the questions by typing them in the chat box, and that you'll find it on the right side of your screen. And in case you can't see it, there should be an orange icon. Just click on that icon and you should be able to see the chat box to send in your question. And now I want to move back to Victor. And Victor, now I'm going to send you a request to share your screen so that you can share your presentation with us. So Victor, yes, we can see you now.
Yeah, can you hear me now?
Yes, please go ahead with the presentation.
Okay, great. Good morning, everyone, and I'm really pleased to be with you people today as a speaker in today's webinar. And thanks for the introduction. I'm actually the special advisor to the executive director of Rural Electrification Agency, and one of my roles is actually to facilitate an integrated energy planning for rural electrification. But I'll just give you a little rundown of Nigeria. From the introduction perspective. So Nigeria presents one of the largest and most attractive off-grid opportunity in the world, basically because of the people, the number of people without electricity. And again, if you look at the rationale for this, is that over $14 billion. I mean, this figure was based on 2020, 15, 2016. New figures are coming out where there is a potential they were spending over $30 billion on inefficiency, on inefficient and expensive noisy generators. Based on our research, again, there are quick understanding that we could have a potential of 100 mini grids of over 100 kilowatts being implemented over the next 10 years to meet what we call our 30-30 goal, and to do this, the Rural Electrification Agency saddled with the task to support the Nigerian market under the they call it the Power Sector Recovery Program. So what is REA? REA is the Rural Electrification Agency and is the implementing agency of the federal government tasked with rural electrification to underserved and unserved communities. We do have a mandate here, and that's our mission is to provide access to reliable energy, and mandate is to promote rural electrification. But overall is to actually stimulate rural economic development. And how do we do that? We do that with what we start with the electrification planning. I'm not going to go so deep into electrification planning because my co-speaker earlier on, Dr. Catherine, has actually unpacked the process, and it's whatever the process of that was undertaken in Tanzania, it's similar to what is being undertaken in Nigeria. But what we'll be focusing right now is what do we look out for when we start our off-grid integrated planning. So one of the basic things is that we started off with what we call the grid extension. Now, the grid extension was the foundation for our electrification planning towards the peri-urban, the urban, peri-urban to the rural areas. So the rural areas were meant to get their supply from the peri-urban through grid extension. But this wasn't really coming out smoothly due to some political undertone and political interest. So we decided to now move to the other element of power capacity, and that is the solar home system, the mini grid, and what we call now the undergrid. And also then from there we looked at not just the rural areas where the solar and the solar home systems or the mini or undergrid will be deployed. We also looked at energizing the economy, and these energizing economy are clusters of industries or clusters of small scale commercial SMEs that are located within the rural, within the urban region and also the peri-urban. We also looked at the education element because, again, you found that the education schools or infrastructures are also located within the rural and the urban or the peri-urban areas. And that gave us a bit of scope to now look at beyond just the rural community. And so it became more of that integrated planning approach. How do we ensure we meet our 30-30-30 mandate of 90% electricity assets? So all these considerations were taken into the strides, and we moved on. But however, we knew there were challenges in effective electrification planning. And this time, I'm not coming from a technical perspective, but I'm talking about both from a social technical perspective, whereby there were lack of accurate and up-to-date data. And my colleague, Dr. Catherine, also mentioned that the things that you need to focus on to ensure that you have that coverage. We also looked at the capacity of the key ministries. Now, within the ministries, now it's not only about REA, because we actually need to work with a lot of stakeholders, especially from the MDAs. The MDAs are called the Ministries, Department, and Agency under the federal government. It was really also key that we enable them to be able to support in that integrated electrification planning. And again, you look at the high cost of investment and of the grid extension plan from DISCOs. Now, within the electricity system, if you look at this, we have what we call the GenCos, called the generation companies. We have the distribution companies and the transmission. Transmission is owned by the government, and the GenCos are the generation companies, are the private sectors that actually supply this electricity from our two main sources, the gas and also hydro, large-scale hydropowers, and that is transmitted to the DISCOs. The DISCOs are distribution companies that actually distribute this electricity through the grid. But as at today, there are a lot of financial issues concerning that element, and so grid extension was really going to be a problem, especially for the DISCOs to come in. And then we have the profitability concerns in the rural areas. These were key things that we found that that we probably not be able to go through this planning without understanding the context, the finance, the project finance within the rural areas. And unpacking all that, these key elements, the financial, operational, technical, practical, and policy, they all became a building block for us to drive mini grid, drive the solar home system, and drive the on-the-grid. Now, these three power systems were looked at, and to be able to meet the demands of the rural communities, the energizing education, energizing programs, energizing education, and also economy within Nigeria. From a policy context, the policy was to say, okay, listen, we're going to look at all this, power structure, but how practical will they be like? How practical can we implement them? And how technically feasible will they be able to meet up with the demands? And also operationally, over the long-term period, how will it look like? And financially, will the developers, the mini-grid developers, solar home companies, will they be able to make gains? And how do we also integrate the existing foundation, that's the DISCOs and the developers, especially from the on-the-grid perspective, whereby the prospect of on-the-grid is now growing in Nigeria, where we look at existing infrastructures such as the distribution line, and having the DISCOs work with the developers to supply decentralized renewable energy through the existing infrastructure for rural communities. So all those things became a very strong building block for us. And then we had to bring what we call the stakeholders mapping. So we brought everybody together to say, listen, these are the building blocks. How do we deal with this? And our two separate stakeholders, the public sector and the private sector. So if you look at the two zeros, these two circles, you find out that you see the DISCOs were part of that whole perspective, the whole context, and the GenCos were also part of it. The off-grid developers also part of it. Consumers and the industry became part of that whole private sector to drive the off-grid planning. Then the public systems, you see the Federal Ministry of Power, Canals, the REA, the NERC. Now, I know my colleague did mention something about the issues about the mini-grid, when the grid extension comes in, what happens. So what we did was we had what we call the mini-grid regulation of 2016, where there were caveats and incentives to the off-grid developers. For instance, when an off-grid developer goes through that whole process, the whole value chain. Now, it's on the onion that within the regulation that the DISCOs can't come into that rural area in the next 5 or 10 years. So that's one. And if they do come earlier than that, there are incentives that they will pay. One incentive is this, that they will pay the remaining life shell of the financial amount to the developer, number one. So if the developer had done 5 years, remaining 20 years, they have to pay the remaining fee. And they will also pay 1 year fee to the developer. That's 1 year profit or revenue fee to the developer. And so that is another way of, incentivizing the developer and discouraging the DISCOs from just coming in to, take over the grid. But the good thing about it is that as of today, there is that on the grid infrastructure infrastructure that we've started embarking, where the discos and the off-grid developers are working together. Well, this next slide, I mean, we've all seen this next slide based on the fact that Dr. Catherine showed us what indicators do we need to use for the mapping. And so also in Nigeria, we look at this kind of distance to the grid, which is very important. We look particularly now, we are looking at productive use. A little bit of concern came towards the ability to pay and willingness to pay, because it was quite easy to go to the rural community and ask them, will you be able to pay X, Y, Z? And they say, yes, they'll be able to pay. Will they be willing to do that? Yes. Do you have the ability? And the ability to pay is always like measuring between what they expend in the diesel compared to what will be coming in if we are to deploy solar home system or the mini grid. So it's always like, yes, they could actually afford that. But at the long run, we found out that it became a problematic, because as of today, we do have revenue concerns of mini grid. So productive uses of energy became the key cornerstone for us to stimulate off-grid planning in Nigeria. Having said that, methodology, I don't want to go too deep into this, because again, Dr. Catherine has given us a lot of context on how do we identify areas using GIS, geospatial, and there's what we call the QGIS. And so those are similar ways of actually planning for electricity. But another good thing about this, if you look at the top part, you see number of poles requiring replacement. Now, there was elements of undergrid, whereby these are things that we look at when we want to deploy undergrid. You see the number of poles, the network layout, the condition, and the supply condition. Now, all this is because there's an existing distribution grid. Existing distribution infrastructure in place that needs to just integrate with the solar home system. The solar PVs that the off-grid developers will be bringing under the mini grid scenario. Moving forward, so methodology, again, this is similar to what Dr. Catherine also said. And the good thing about this is also training of enumerators who will use those applications and tools. And this is also a sample of total household just a sample of how when data are collected and the tools that are being implemented and the tools to be used for the implementation. And finally, this is a new one that GIZ, one of our partners, are also doing, and this is from an on-grid perspective. This is ongoing, whereby we have the Reconnect drive and also the mobile mapping, and the full details of this will shortly be brought out maybe by January, February. But this is another tool that we are using for our data collection, and we're working with GIZ to simulate this in Nigeria. And finally, and this is the last part, our tools, our processes, what our processes has done is to enable developers and investors to identify promising sites for off-grid development. So you can look at from an on-grid infrastructure, what is existing. You can also look at the features of off-grid infrastructures, community details, resources, and amenities, just to help us understand how we can integrate an efficient and effective electricity planning from the perspective of on-grid, mini-grid, undergrid, and also solar home systems. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Victor, for such an enriching presentation. I'm now quickly going to switch back to my screen. So now that I have switched back to my screen, and after Victor's amazing presentation about his experiences and work in Nigeria, I want to move to our third presenter for today, Christopher Wesley Ajan. And Christopher is working as the manager within the Rural Energy Department for the Sarawak Energy Malaysia. Sarawak is a utility company responsible for generation, distribution, and transmission of electricity for the state of Sarawak in Malaysia. And today he is going to bring in the perspective of utility. And Christopher, now I'm going to make you a presenter so that you can share your screen. And you're also unmuted now.
Okay, thank you, Anisha. Can you hear me well?
Yes, please go ahead with the presentation.
Okay, thank you, Ranisha. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. I'm in Malaysia today. Now it's around 6 p.m. Thank you to Dipti from HPNet for inviting me to this webinar. And thank you for my colleague as well, Katrina and Victor, for your interesting presentation. So today I will share my experience and knowledge in rural electrification, in particular for Sarawak state in Malaysia. So just a little bit about Sarawak Energy. This company has been around since 1921, and currently our workforce is around 5,000 staff strong, and our state electricity coverage now at 96%. The one on the slide is 2017. The most recent one is 96. However, when we look into the rural coverage, our electricity coverage is currently at 92%. So there are still 8% more to go. So besides providing reliable electricity supply to the development of Sarawak, rural electrification remains our main priority in the next few years. This is our current situation in Sarawak. As for your information, Sarawak is located in the Southeast Asia, on the east side of Malaysia, in the island called Borneo, and with a population of 3 million. In terms of the electricity, as you can see, most of our electricity infrastructure is on the coastal side of the Sarawak, mainly in the major cities or towns in the coastal area. So in terms of planning, we categorize our population or our settlements in Sarawak into 3 categories when it comes to the rural electrification. So category 1 are those that is nearer to the existing infrastructure. So the best method of connecting them to electricity is using the conventional grid. For the category 2, they are further in terms of distance, as well as more challenging in terms of accessibility. Either the road condition is not as good as in town, so mainly it's a dirt road or timber road that we have in the rural area. So this area actually need to upgrade the road infrastructure before the grid is possible. Lastly, but not the least, category 3, where the one that is in the red color, those are considered to be too remote to be connected to the grid for the foreseeable future within 5 to 10 years. So out of all these 3 categories, category 3 are the one that I'm putting priority on in order to provide them electricity. And the method that we use for the category 3 is using hybrid system or a standalone solar system. Okay. All right. So there are 2 methods of accelerating our rural electrification. Number 1, using grid. So in order to expand our existing grid infrastructure to the rural area, we actually need to upgrade our electricity infrastructure, such as our transmission line as well as our substation. So this is already in line. Currently, we are building 2 extra high voltage transmission substation, as well as a 9 medium voltage substation in strategic areas, so that we can expand our infrastructure to the rural area. On the other half of the equation, we also consider off-grid solution, especially for the rural and the most remote villages in Sarawak. So these are the villages that are unreachable by the existing grid. So the state government of Sarawak have recently allocated a large amount of resources to us, to Sarawak Energy, in an amount of 2.3 billion ringgit equivalent to 575 million USD to implement both this project. This is the map of different type of project that is ongoing right now in our planning as well. For the grid, as you can see from the legend there, RPSS and RES are grid connected infrastructure, while SARES is the off-grid infrastructure that we plan to implement in this couple of years. Okay, so next I will talk more in particular on the SARES scheme. So the existing electricity supply to remote community in Sarawak are mainly using generator set. So as you can see, the type of villages that we have in Sarawak are very diverse. Some are very small in terms of population of household. Some of them are actually quite large in the scale of 100 to 200 households. So most of the settlements are actually located along the main river. And currently, most of them rely on diesel generator to provide them with the electricity that they need. And in terms of the installation of the electricity, we can see that in terms of the wiring that was installed are not up to the standard that we desire. So these are some of the challenges that are facing by our rural community in Sarawak. So for SARES, which is a short form for Sarawak Alternative Rural Electrification Scheme, this scheme was initiated by the state government of Sarawak in 2016, and it is targeted villages which are remote from our existing grid. And in terms of the implementation, we design a system that is applicable to be used in the rural community where there is a very what do you call that? In terms of the operation and maintenance requirement is very minimum. And most of the villages in this all the villages in these areas are actually have limited disposable income. So the government of Sarawak decided that when we built this SARES scheme, there will not be any tariff or electricity charged to the customer. So this is something that is very different from other rural electrification scheme. And lastly, Sarawak Energy is given the responsibility not only to implement the project, we are also given the responsibility to provide long-term technical support to ensure the sustainability of the project. Okay, a little bit about the SARES scheme. In terms of the power of level of services provided by the SARES scheme, the power capacity given per household is between 700 to 1,000 watt. In terms of the energy, the daily energy provided to each household is at 3,000 watt hour. And the main component here is the battery provided in this SARES scheme is able to provide energy for continuous 3 days when there is a bad weather. In terms of the sustainability of the system, we have decided to install an energy limiter on each of the household. This system allows us to manage the usage of the energy and also to prolong the lifespan of the battery. Now I'm going to talk a bit more about the planning of the implementation of SARES project. There are many stakeholders in the SARES implementation. So of course, the number one, the government and the ministry are the most crucial players and driver in the implementation of SARES. They provide the direction, the policy, as well as the funding for us to implement the project. Once the direction has been set by the government, then the work on the ground can begin. First of all, Sarawak Energy, as the only utility company in Sarawak, is entrusted to implement SARES in all over Sarawak. So when we started our project, the first engagement that we will do is with the local government. In this case, we call them as a district officer, as well as the community leaders. So as you can see from the second step, we gather all the information that we required about the local population and villages information from the local government. And at this time, we also gain more information from the local communities on the actual information about the village in terms of the household availability and also in terms of the accessibility of the villages. Once we gather the relevant information, then we will start our implementation by rolling out the project in phases. For the planning of SARES project, we do the implementation in 6 phases in total, and every phase is equivalent to 1 year of implementation period. When we carry out the project, the first thing that we do is do a proper clustering. This is to allow us to combine together several villages that are nearby to each other so that we can implement the project more efficiently. And the third step in our implementation process is the community engagement. This is the most crucial part of the implementation because we need to have the buy-in or the approval from the community before we can implement the project. One of the major issues that we need to resolve or to settle is in terms of the land that is required for the installation of the solar farm. Okay. And lastly, but not least, number 4, joint survey with contractors. These are all the contractors that we bring along with us to the village so that they can see for themselves in terms of the implementation of the SARES so that they can provide the equipment that is necessary to complete the task. Okay, one of the major priority in SARES implementation is the development of local solar contractors. So this is in line with the aspiration of the government to develop local contractors that are capable of implementing the solar project so that we will have a high percentage of local content when we implement the project. Initially, in 2016, when we started the project, there are limited number of contractors that are capable. But year by year, we managed to develop and bring in more contractors and develop their capability so that they, together with us, can contribute to the electrification of the rural community. Some of the challenges in the implementation of SARES project. Number 1 is basically the remoteness of the location in Sarawak. So transportation to remote location is the biggest challenge that we face. However, with the cooperation from the local community as well as the contractor that we have appointed, we managed to overcome all the challenges that we have. And some of the location, actually there is no access of machinery, so we also need to use the local community to support us. Second, in terms of the electrical and the civil work, we have very strong contractors that are well established in doing electrical and civil work. So this is the part where their competency and capability is required. The third part is the major solar equipment. So as you can see, there are quite a lot of batteries involved in the project. So, and currently we are using the conventional lead-acid battery as well as some more advanced lithium-ion batteries. In terms of the specification of the inverters and the solar chargers, we have selected to evaluate only and approve only those that we think is suitable for the condition in the rural area. These are some of the completed SARES project in Sarawak. The one on the topmost is in Long Pila in Miri, which is capable of providing electricity to around 200 households. So the other part of the planning for SARES implementation in order to ensure the sustainability of the project is we need to make sure that the community is well engaged. So when the completion of the project, we will start with our training program. We will engage the community. Number one, we arrange for the villagers together with us to attend a training. Number one is to ensure that the villagers understand in terms of the electrical safety as well as the energy consumption. And number two, in terms of the basic training on the cleaning, vegetation, and general cleanliness of the solar system. This is to ensure that the system will last and sustain. When there is any fault in the system, the villagers will be able to identify the fault. If they are able to restart the system, they will do it on their own. However, if they are unable to do it, they will contact the nearest Sarawak Energy office, and then we will provide the technical assistance. And this is a photo for us to celebrate the success of SARES project. So every time we finish a phase of SARES project, we will invite the local representative as well as the representative from the community so that we can join together and celebrate the completion. So during this time, we also will emphasize on the cooperation of the local community so that they can give us the support to ensure that the system is well maintained. Okay, so this is my progress so far for SARES. Currently, we have around 238 villages completed and benefited around 3,300 households. And in terms of our future planning, currently we already completed 4 years of SARES phases, and there are 2 more phases to go. Lesson learned from all of this, number one is all the key stakeholders need to work together. The community, the government, as well as the utility company, not to forget the contractor as well. Number two, the design of the solar system must be reliable and suitable for use with little maintenance by the villagers. And number three, our partnership with the local contractors and building their local capability is important. We also, at the same time, develop off-grid solar training certificate in order to provide training and competency certification for the workers that are involved in the SARES project. Lastly, this is a group of SARES staff that are working with me in our aim to deliver to achieve our 100% rural electrification target. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Christopher. Excuse me. Thank you, Christopher, for sharing your experience within the SARES project and especially sharing your challenges, achievements, and so on. We have a lot of questions coming up for you. So without further ado, I would like to switch back to my screen. And then I'll also quickly mute you. So as you can see on my screen, now it's time for Q&A. And thank you to every one of you for sending in all of your valuable questions. We will now address them to the respective speakers. And to moderate the Q&A session, I would like to invite my co-host, Dipti. And Dipti, I'm gonna unmute you now.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar, and many thanks to our speakers for their very interesting presentations. The reason HPNet has a thematic work stream on integrated energy planning is that we are seeing across our member countries where great effort and resources are put into mini-grid development, but the mini-grids on the ground constantly have to compete with the national grid. And in our other thematic work stream on grid interconnection, we are seeing that there's actually mutual benefit for the main grid and mini grids to interact, but that kind of smart grid cannot be developed without a robust energy planning process. And our speakers today have done a really excellent job in firstly talking about the tools and the data that is required, what aspects of government planning, and then in Christopher's final presentation, this very key important component of stakeholders and especially local stakeholder involvement. So that is just a quick recap of the presentations. And to go into the questions that have come up, so for Katharina, there are questions around whether this tool is available for public use, and how has the experience from Tanzania, have they shared how they have been using the tool? Does the data have to be updated? Could you share some points around these questions?
Yes, sure. Thanks, Dipti, for the questions, and thanks for the audience for receiving questions. The tool in Tanzania, for the development, we also exchanged with the Rural Electrification Agency, but at the moment it's not updated on an ongoing basis. It is possible in theory, so that could be done, and I also think that it would be very beneficial. It was just one project which ended at some point, so unfortunately, while it is online available for free for everyone to use, no updated data is fed into it, but we do work on other examples. For example, as my colleague Dr. Victor Osu briefly mentioned, we are also working on Nigeria with the Federal Ministry of Power, and there we do develop a huge database in order to make it possible to always draw the data we visualize from the most updated version, and that the respective stakeholders can update frequently. So it's not kind of a static web tool or something, but it will show the development and the improvement and yeah, the current changes. So that's something which is I think very helpful, but sometimes it's difficult to implement it in single projects.
Great, thank you. And some questions for Dr. Victor. Firstly, is it right, the questioner asked, is it right to consider off-grid as a separate approach, or are you also focusing on grid interconnection? And if so, how? Along with that, there are a number of audience members asking whether you include more than solar PV in your planning. And finally, how do you incorporate productive end use you mentioned it, but if you can share a little bit more on how you do that.
Oh, okay, right. Thanks, and thank you for the questions also. So I'll just pick up on the first one, the off-grid and the grid interconnection. Yes, we're not only focusing on off-grid, but as at now, our primary focus is to try and stimulate the off-grid market, and then the next target is now to delve into grid interconnection, and that will come under the platform of the undergrid. Recently, we just launched. We finalized a procurement call for undergrid project, whereby the plan is to have the existing distribution infrastructure integrated to a solar PV, and then try to use that to supply electricity to the rural areas. And then in turn, the discos are involved, so they know that potentially there may be that interconnection with the grid. So that is a prospect that we are looking at, but we just want to start with the undergrid first of all. We call that the interconnected mini grid acceleration scheme. That's what we are doing right now, and hopefully by next year we should have about 14 being deployed, working in Nigeria. I'll go to the second question. No, we're not only looking at solar PV. Solar PV was more like a testing ground, and now as I speak, we are working with Untitled to start looking at small hydropower system within the range of 100 to 900 and to about 900 kilowatts. And so we started work with our partners on that, and hopefully by January we should have some sites to start undertaking what we call the pre-feasibility study, and then Untitled supporting us to do some concrete implementation over 2020. And finally, how do we cooperate PU? Yes, just 2 weeks ago, we had what we call the Agric Energy Nexus conference in Nigeria that was held by REA, facilitated by REA with other key stakeholders. So the way we're doing this is 2 ways. We have what we call the demand assessment, and also the demand. What's the name again? I know there was a demand assessment and also the demand analysis. So it has to do with an existing site and a site that is yet to be existed with mini grids. And so one of the things we're working with the ministry, we'll be working with the Ministry of Agriculture from an agricultural perspective to see the crops of food or the economic activities in relation to agriculture that will be viable within the cluster, within the rural community. Having said that, there are a lot of indicators, infrastructure that is also required, but energy, pertaining to energy, that element will be brought onto the forefront of REA, and then we will now integrate. We will use that as a site identification process, and then we will then stimulate it using the geospatial, the imagery, the survey, and other tools to ensure that other indicators aside from energy is within that broader view of electrification planning. I don't want to go into details because it's a lot of process, but that is just a bit of surface of what we are currently doing to stimulate PU in electrification planning. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Yeah, and some questions for Christopher. Several people would like to know about the no-pay bill scheme and how you're still able to ensure financial sustainability, and also who then maintains the system, and for how long will the tariff not be charged? There are a few other questions, but I'll let you answer that first.
Okay, thank you, Diti. Thank you for the question. Yeah, the way Sarawak Energy and the state government of Sarawak implementing this SARES scheme is a bit different from, I guess, from the rest of the world. So the decision not to enforce any tariff was done by the government. So number one, the state government are considering the population, especially the rural population, which are the most disadvantaged population in community in Sarawak. So they don't have sufficient disposable income. So the government instead apply a community-based project. In one way, the community are actually providing the land for the solar system free of charge. So that is the agreement that the state government and the community coming into play. So the community will provide the land free of charge so that the government do not have to pay any compensation for the land. And in return, the government together with the Sarawak Energy, we install the solar system for them, and once it's completed, it will be provided free of charge to the community. However, upon completion, in order to ensure the sustainability of the electricity supply, there is another agreement between the community and Sarawak Energy. This agreement simply stated that the community responsible for the day-to-day basic maintenance and operation of the system. Of course, Sarawak Energy will provide the technical training. And at the same time, if there is any major fault, the responsibility will be on Sarawak Energy to repair, to do the troubleshooting and revise the system. In terms of the cost financing of the project, it is 100% by the government. So it's basically a public fund by the government. So there is a role by the community, by the contractor, of course. In terms of the private sector, the funding is public. However, the private sector, in our case, will be the contractors that will be awarded the contract so that they can provide the solar power system to the community, and at the same time they definitely will gain some financial benefit from it. So that is my simple question. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And what is the total number of megawatts installed, and what will be installed once the program is completed?
Okay, so currently by end of this year, we expect around 277 villages will be electrified since the phase 1 until phase 4, and a total of almost 8,000 households. So 8,000 households is equivalent to 8 megawatt. So one household is equivalent to 1 kilowatt. So that will be 8,000 8 megawatt of system. It will be installed by end of this year. Thank you.
Yes, okay, thank you. And I'd like to point out that Sarawak region, the electrification rate you said was around 90%, right? And Saras is for this last hard to reach communities.
Yeah, it's always difficult to reach the last few percent. Those are the most difficult to achieve. So in terms of the resources that's needed is also quite extensive. So the state government aspiration, as well as the people of Sarawak, is to have 100% coverage by 2025. But our immediate goal is 2020, where we aim to target 99% statewide rural electrification by 2020. In the rural electrification, the target is 96%.
Okay, and a question for all of you. I mean, it's for one person, but it would be good to hear from all of you about the expected impacts of climate change and how your planning processes will take this into consideration. We start with you, and then Victor and Christopher.
Yes, Dipti, I think I can say a few words. So regarding climate resilience, what we are actually trying to understand is in one research project, we try to find out which areas will be mostly affected by climate change impacts. So where we first will feel the impacts of sea level increase and other things such as a higher frequency of extreme weather events, and also then looking at that in terms of energy planning and thinking about how to improve the local living conditions by providing access to clean electricity, but also to include, for example, access to information and communication in that regard, so that people can get informed and stay informed and connected while these events may take place. So that's something quite new, but I think there we do have the focus on Southeast Asia, and I think quite some island nations are specifically affected. But of course, I feel that it will become very important as well in Sub-Saharan Africa, maybe to understand where the impacts will be strongest on maybe also agricultural settings when we have droughts and floods, and how energy systems can help to improve the local resilience.
Great, thank you. Yeah, Victor, would you have insights into this for Nigeria?
Well, okay, thank you again. From the context of climate change, what we're doing now is that we're rigorously working with the Federal Ministry of Environment. And just last year with UNDP, we just commissioned what we call the Investment and Financial Flow project, whereby REA, through me, is leading that piece of work. So we're looking at 5 sectors. We're looking at the industry, we're looking at the agriculture, and the power, the oil and gas, and also transport system. And so those are very key elements within the IFF, and in which substantially energy is actually key parameters to that whole piece of work. We're also currently, we will be enhancing our what they call this again, the NDC, through what we call the Climate Enhancement Action Program, whereby more mitigation scenario action plan is being developed, and we will be extending that relationship with UNDP and also GIZ on that platform. And just recently, we actually had a workshop on the power scenario that was developed by HBS, Renewable Foundation, and a German Institute of Research on the power scenario to 2040 within the context of climate change. So that has been picked up, and then REA is going to be on the forefront leading that element, that part of it. Climate agriculture, smart climate agriculture is something we're also looking at. The meeting was held last week with the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, with REA will be leading that, but through its energy process. So I think for us, there's a lot of integrated energy stroke climate change transitioning potential now for us in 2020. And so, yes, so climate change is going to be a very big game changer for us within the context of mitigation and within the context of the off-grid market in Nigeria in the coming years. Thank you.
Yeah, great, thank you. Christopher, in your engagement with local stakeholders, has climate adaptation been in the dialogue?
Yeah, from my own experience when engaging with the local community in the rural areas of Sarawak, we actually learn from them that right now there is erratic weather pattern, especially in the rural area. Previously, we have a very clear-cut dry season as well as a rainy season, so that it's easier for the villagers or the community to do their farming or their agriculture. So now the weather system are quite erratic, and then this actually affect the way the livelihood of the villagers. So in terms of SARES implementation, we hope that with the availability of the electricity provided to the community, they can readjust the method of agriculture and utilize fully the electricity that's provided to them in order to mitigate some of the effect of the climate change. Overall, in terms of as a utility company in Sarawak, we are focusing very much on renewable energy in the next year, we are planning to roll out a large-scale solar scheme in Sarawak. So we hope that there will be more contribution of renewable energy in generation mix for Sarawak as a whole. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, this topic of climate adaptation within planning, which is already a very involved process of needing to bring together different ministries and stakeholders and accurate, up-to-date data, it adds a whole nother dimension. So yeah, we appreciate the question that was sent on this. And yeah, I would just like to summarize that some of the key things that came out are that to do inclusive integrated energy planning, there has to be some sort of data collection method and ways to keep that data relevant, so keeping it updated. Secondly, there has to be the different solutions kind of already foreseen, whether it is grid interconnection or clusters of mini grids integrated to each other. So once there are options, you can see which is what best for which beneficiary community. And finally, this very key notion of stakeholder involvement, it sounds like makes plans into action. If the right stakeholders are not involved, plans don't move forward into actual implementation. So with that, we would like to conclude this dialogue. We sincerely appreciate all of the questions that were sent and of course the speakers who took time to present today. Renisha, I will let you close.
Thank you, Dipti. And now we are back to my screen towards the final slide. So like Dipti said, a huge thank you to all our speakers for your brilliant presentation. Excuse me. I think we all learned, excuse me over that. We all learned a lot today, and that also shows in all the amazing questions that came up after your presentation. And also a huge thank you to you, the audience, for staying with us towards the end. And as I mentioned earlier, we will share a recording as well as the webinar presentation after the webinar. So you'll get a follow-up email where you have a link, and at this link you can download the presentation as well as listen to the or watch the video one more time. So as we come towards the end of the webinar, again, one more time, a huge thank you. And now I would like to close the webinar and wish you all a good day. Thank you so much.